Today we're going to take a look at this puff stitch pattern. Now, puff stitches are great little textural stitches that are really quite easy to work, and I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So I've got a foundation chain already begun, and I'm going to begin my first row by working a puff stitch into the third chain from the hook. So remember when you're crocheting into the foundation chain that this loop on the hook does not count as a stitch. So the third chain is 1, 2, 3. It's this one right here. I'm just going to keep my thumb there as a placeholder. And now to work my puff stitch, I'm going to yarn over hook, insert into the chain, drop a loop 3 times, then yarn over hook and draw through all loops on the hook. So that might sound like a mouthful, but it's really quite simple. Yarn over hook, insert into my chain, and drop a loop. I'm going to do that 3 times. So that was once, yarn over hook, insert into the chain, and drop a loop, yarn over hook, insert into the chain, drop a loop. Now that I've done that 3 times, I'm going to yarn over hook and draw through all my loops on the hook. So all we're really doing is creating a series of loops and cinching them all together at the top. That's all a puff stitch is. So now I'm going to begin my pattern repeat, which is chain 1, skip next 2 chains, so that's the foundation chain, skip 1, 2, and work a puff stitch into the next chain. So yarn over hook, insert into my chain, drop a loop, do that 3 times, yarn over hook, insert into chain, drop a loop, yarn over hook, insert into the chain, drop a loop, then we're going to yarn over hook and draw through all loops on the hook. Chain 1, skip next 2 chains and make a puff stitch. Yarn over hook, insert into the chain, drop a loop, yarn over hook, insert into the chain, drop a loop, yarn over hook, insert into chain, drop a loop. So that's 3 times, yarn over hook and draw through all loops on your hook. Chain 1, and now I'm skipping 2 chains on my foundation chain and making a puff stitch into my last chain here. So this is just one type of puff stitches. There's many different types of puff stitches, and just make sure you check the stitch glossary or abbreviations in your pattern. It might be a little different than the one we're working here today. So there's my last puff stitch, and that's it for row 1, or first row. And now I'm going to turn my work to work row 2, and I'm going to begin with a chain 2. 1, 2, and that doesn't count as a stitch. That's just a turning chain. It's just to give us some height so that we can work our next stitch without it being pulled. So our next stitch is 1 HDC in the first stitch, which is the top of my puff stitch. So I'm going to yarn over hook, insert into my stitch, drop a loop, yarn over hook, draw through all 3 loops on my hook. That's my HDC made, or half double crochet. Now I'm going to make a puff stitch in the next chain 1 space. So when we're working into a chain 1 space, it's not actually working into the chain, we're working into the big open space that's underneath that chain 1. That's the difference between working into the chain. If our pattern said puff stitch in the next chain, we'd work into the chain, but this is puff stitch into the next chain 1 space. So it's the space under our chain 1. So I'm going to work my puff stitch again, which is yarn over hook, insert into space, drop a loop, do that 3 times. And then I'm going to yarn over hook and draw through all of those loops. Chain 1, skip the next puff stitch, and then puff stitch into the next chain 1 space. Yarn over hook, insert into space, drop a loop 3 times, and then close it by yarn over hook and drawing through all of those loops. Chain 1 Now I'm at my last chain one space. I'm gonna work another puff stitch. And one thing that helps keep your puff stitch neat, you can see as I yarn over hook and drop a loop, I'm just gonna tug on my hook a little bit, just to elongate that loop that I've brought up and make sure that all of my loops are relatively the same length. It doesn't matter too much, but it's just a nice little tip to make your puff stitches neater. Okay, and now I'm at the end of my row. After I've made my puff stitch, I'm just going to HDC or half double crochet into the top of my last puff stitch. I'm going to work my third row, which is the last row of the stitch repeat, or row repeat I should say. I'm going to chain 2. Again, that doesn't count as a stitch. It's just my turning chain. And then I'm going to work 1 puff stitch in the first HDC. So just as before, yarn over hook, drop a loop 3 times. Yarn over hook, draw through all of your loops. Then chain 1, skip your puff stitch and work into the chain 1 space, a puff stitch. So every row is just puff stitches separated by chain 1s, and you're always working into the chain 1 spaces and skipping the puff stitches. So on your odd number rows, or your right side rows, you'll have 1 more puff stitch than on your even numbered rows or wrong side rows. That's just because the pattern staggers. You can see I have 4 down here, and then I have 3 on my second row, and now I'm going to have 4 on my last row. So my last puff stitch of my third row is going to be worked into the HDC, not into a chain space. And that's it for my third row. So if you repeat the last 2 rows, that creates the stitch pattern you see here. And we've indicated a right side and a wrong side, but it really is essentially reversible. It's a really great texture pattern, and it's really quite simple. So that's all there is to puff stitch.